So I'm delighted to partner here with Karen de Rochemont, my colleague and partner and head of policy and engagement at Veris, to interview Timothy Smith. So Karen, do you want to introduce our guest of honor?
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. I'm happy to introduce our guest for today's webinar, Tim Smith. Tim is a responsible investing pioneer, a leader in corporate responsibility and shareholder engagement for over 5 decades now. Tim started his journey with a BA from the University of Toronto and Master's of Divinity degree from Union Theological Seminary. He is a founding staff member of Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, where he served as staff for 30 years, including 24 years as executive director, and currently as their senior policy advisor. Additionally, Tim led Boston Trust Walden's shareholder engagement efforts for 22 years, beginning in 2000. Tim has been named in numerous honors, including Top 100 Most Influential People in Business Ethics in multiple years, the Joan Bavaria Award for Impact, and was also named as one of the most influential people in corporate governance by the National Association of Corporate Directors. We are excited to have Tim join us for this conversation.
Thank you, Karen. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you.
So we're going to start. I know you've spent decades with ICCR, so we would love to hear from you and for our audience. What is ICCR? What strategies does it use, and what issues does it work on? We're just going to start really with the basics.
Great, and I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks so much. I've had a chance to work with Veris Wealth Partners over the decades, and really appreciate your leadership. So as Karen indicated, I was one of the early founders of ICCR in the 1970s. And ICCR at present now is growing to, as we're over 50 years old, growing to be an organization composed of about 300 investors, small and large. We include religious investors, foundations, pension funds, trade unions, and investment managers too. ICCR uses its members use a whole variety of strategies and approaches to address their work. Of course, they are active share owners, and so we engage companies in conversations through letters, and sometimes through shareholder resolutions, where we file resolutions for discussion and then debated and votes at stockholders meetings. But we're also involved in public policy concerns. We're involved in trying to do public education about ESG and being a leading force to try to protect our industry as we're under attack now, as we haven't seen before, and we'll talk about later. So those are that's our basic approach. We work on dozens of issues, everything from climate change to diversity, human rights to lobbying and political spending, drug pricing and opioid addiction. You go down a very, very long list of issues that our members are engaging companies on, and doing it with some, I think, some positive impact over the decades.
That sounds great, Tim. Thank you. Maybe we could jump into what are some of the best examples of these positive outcomes achieved through shareholder engagement that you've seen. Maybe you could share one from historical perspective and one more recent.
Well, thanks for that question, which could take the whole of our time together. So I know Stephanie will, and you, Karen, will control me. But if you look over the decades of work that investors have engaged companies and tried to be a voice in the marketplace, there are literally, well, I would say scores and scores and scores of examples where companies have changed their policies and practices in response to either encouragement from or pressure from their share owners, from their investors. So one of the issues that many people will remember historically was the whole question of investing in apartheid South Africa, where in the 1970s, it was actually the Episcopal Church that filed the very first shareholder resolution on a social issue by a religious group. And it was filed with General Motors, encouraging them to disengage from South Africa because of the apartheid system. And that resolution led to literally hundreds of companies being engaged over 2 decades of work. So we have to be careful here not to pretend that one strategy or one set of voices was the primary voice for bringing about pressures on South Africa. It was a whole range of global pressures. But I think it is important to note that the investor voice, or even the voice of universities and other institutions decided to sell their shares and divest from companies in South Africa, those voices were heard in corporate boardrooms, as were the shareholder resolutions that populated company proxy statement for decades. So you know the history. South Africa, facing such dire economic pressure, decided to come to the negotiating table, and the result was Nelson Mandela being freed from prison and becoming the president of South Africa. So a key issue that is an example of working on something for decades, right? 20 years plus of hard work on that issue. But to jump more into the more current times, the work that not just the faith community is doing, but so many investors are doing on climate change is so significant, because we face a climate crisis. We all know that. And this is a time where investors are letting companies know that they either appreciate their leadership or need them to step up and address the climate crisis with urgency. And that means reducing their greenhouse gas impact and doing positive things to address climate change. So one example would be pressures that ICCR members have been putting on companies on their climate lobby, like how they're trying to influence public policy on climate. And so our initiatives have been pressing companies to look at what they say they stand for, and yet how their government affairs departments may be lobbying contrary to their views. And certainly some of their trade associations, like the Chamber of Commerce, would be undercutting their very values. So it's interesting that you have issues like climate change, where I think our voice has been exceedingly important, but at the same time, we're all realistic, and we recognize that whether it's the voice of investors or governments or NGOs and environmental groups, we're all fighting very hard to try to make solutions to climate change a reality. And we are all somewhat discouraged by the lack of adequate progress. But I'll point at one other example, just that for years, investors had been encouraging companies to report meaningful information on what we call sustainability practices. And companies would say, too expensive, nobody will read it, nobody cares, why would we do that? And now, a decade and a half later, 90% of major S&P 500 companies do meaningful sustainability reporting. Now, some could get better, but nonetheless, they recognize this as an issue. So we could go on with numerous other examples of companies changing their governance practices, or companies changing their diversity practices because of shareholder input. And it's one of the reasons why our voices are so important.
Thank you, Tim. And then what's also interesting is the rise of shareholder activism. I mean, it ebbed and flowed, and there's been attacks against the very concept of minority, or all you need to do is own $2,000 of the stock.
Hold it for 3 years.
To be able to file or co-file a resolution, which corporate leaders have considered to be a distraction from the business or attacking the long-term shareholder value. And so can you share with us a little bit the changes that you've seen around shareholder activism in the course of your career? And do you feel like we're seeing more activism, or because ESG is under attack, you're actually seeing people recoil from leveraging this and then going from, you know, instead of engagement, going to divestment or screens?
What a great question. Well, you're right. In the early days, one would celebrate if we filed a shareholder resolution and we got a vote over 3%, because it allowed you to come back the next year. And fair to say, in those early days, many of the investors who were raising questions like questions on diversity or the environment or South Africa were motivated by a social mission, and they were committed to try to present that to the business community. If jumping ahead 5 decades, the landscape, as we all know, is huge as all outdoors. And while we still have many investors who's very concerned about protecting our environment, and that's their first priority, we also have investors with literally tens of trillions of dollars who are active leaders in this ESG space because they see these as issues that affect shareholder value. So I'll give you an example. I served on a panel for Tom DiNapoli, the comptroller of the state of New York, which has well over $250 billion that they manage. And he reminded us, as he was legally required to, that their priority is to protect the financial interests of their beneficiaries, of the pensioners, right? The teachers and et cetera. And therefore, the work that they did on climate or on diversity or on protecting LGBTQ rights was all, their motivation was believing that those issues have an impact on the bottom line. And therefore, companies that are better dealing with them in a more positive way are actually protecting long-term shareholder value. So whether you're New York State or CalPERS or CalSERS, the pension funds in California, or New York City, you'll hear that motivating force often, right? And within ICCR, we have folks who have different motivations for being there. I'm on the board of the pension fund of the United Methodist Church called WestPath. It is fairly large, over $25 billion. And it is a pension board, though. It has to protect its beneficiaries. But they also try to be faithful to their religious beliefs, right? And so they walk that interesting tightrope between faith and finance, and excel at being responsive to both. So the new world we're in is one where we have groups like the Principles for Responsible Investing that have investors globally with over $100 trillion of assets under management that are committed to addressing ESG because they have a firm belief that it affects shareholder value. So they look at environment, social, governance issues because they affect shareholder value. So that's a very different context that we work in today than even 20 years ago. And the new thing you mentioned, Stephanie, that is important to note is we now see conservatives who have a very strong right-wing agenda who are using shareholder resolutions as well. I believe there are about 90 filed this year. And they are strongly opposed to work on diversity. They actually argue that white men are being discriminated against and we should get rid of these affirmative action programs. And many of them are climate deniers and so on. And the interesting thing is they are a loud player in this space. But their resolutions this year, I think the average vote was 2%. So the market responded, right? So the market is responding to a resolution on diversity filed by New York City, or on climate filed by, say, one of your clients or a religious group or a pension fund. who was getting a reasonable vote. And then 3 years ago, we were getting majority votes often. So we see that the marketplace is telling us that the anti-ESG votes, while they have a right to be put on a proxy under the SEC rules, they aren't going to come back because they didn't get enough of a vote. Whereas resolutions on climate have stirred up a considerable, meaningful debate that accelerates positive growth. So we could talk a little bit more about the anti-ESG, but maybe you want to go on with another question first.
So we will, I mean, Karen will ask more around the anti-ESG movement, but I was just curious about, so just to play devil's advocate, there are the votes towards or in support of climate resolutions are gaining more and more momentum, but they're not winning. We're still talking about a victory for the movement is maybe 20%, 30%, but we're still not voting directors out of their roles. We're just giving them lesser support. And so, I mean, do you think that we're going to come to a point where, you know, we just need, it's an issue of coalition building and getting more momentum so that it's no longer just signaling by stronger, you know, minority percentage, but actually majority percentage? Or do you think that will not, that's an optimistic view? Because currently,
No, I like your term signaling.
Okay.
But I'm going to, and I'm glad you asked it as a devil's advocate question. We need to get more of those on the table. So let me start off with the premise that winning is not getting 50%. So oftentimes a resolution is sponsored, or even there's an engagement with a company before a resolution, and you come to a meaningful agreement on companies taking step forward. And a resolution might be sponsored, and about a third of them are withdrawn because there's agreements reached through dialogue with the company. That's positive progress. I don't know if we call them wins or successes, but it's positive progress that the company and the investors have come to common ground. Secondly, if I'm on a board and a shareholder resolution on an issue gets 30% of the vote, I see that as a very important signal. If I'm looking at the pay package of a company, and I'm on the compensation committee, and that pay package gets like a 20% no vote, that's an alarming number for me as a director. And usually a comp committee will immediately go on the road and talk to their large shareholders and say, how do we need to change our formula? What are you concerned about? So I'm going to argue that a resolution of 20 or 30% still sends a message. I'm further going to note that sometimes an issue which was very important, but didn't have, you know, public focus behind it. So let's take an issue like plastic waste, which groups like As You Sow and others have been working on for well over a decade. And in those early years, they were raising the issue thoughtfully, powerfully, but they didn't get much momentum. Now, not only are the votes significant, and a couple of years ago, we got several votes over 50%, but a company can read the tea leaves and say, you know, this is an issue whose time has come. It's material for us. We need to address it. So I guess my point, Stephanie, is this process is not all about getting 50% votes. It's making a meaningful business case that companies, industries, oftentimes government, will embrace and say is important. And then in some cases, in the cycles of the votes that we've seen in the last decade, we did see over 35 majority votes that actually went over 50%. Finally, I'm going to mention, because you mentioned a good point, critics might say, oh, gee, somebody can have $2,000 worth and have owned it for a while and they'll file a resolution. It seems unfair. Well, there's two individuals who are really active proponents, James McRitchie and John Chevedden, who have been filing resolutions as small individual shareholders for years. They've filed it on governance. They're filing it on some of the social and environmental issues as well. And their resolutions, particularly on governance, maybe they had 100 shares, were getting 50, 60, 70% of the vote on some governance reforms. Well, what does that tell you? That tells you that huge institutional investors saw the request that was put on the table to be meaningful and smart governance, and they were going to vote for it, whoever the sponsor was. Interesting, right? So we see people, both small investors and large investors, who have an important voice in creating this change in our marketplace.
Tim, if we could go back to the ESG attacks and explore that a little bit more. The attacks are getting sharper and more political. Could you explore with us the impact? What impact do you believe these attacks might have, and what do you think our response should be?
Boy, this is a matter for another seminar, right? We can bring in a couple of resource people and have another good discussion about this. Well, you're absolutely right, Karen, that the attacks have become sharper, much more politicized. I think they're cannon fodder for some politicians who see this as a way of building their voice, their vote, and their base. Attacks against anti-woke companies and anti-woke investors. So that would be many of the people on this call would be considered woke. But interestingly enough, those attacks are also against companies like Walmart and Intel and other companies that are making commitments to work on diversity and climate and human rights and supply chain, right? So the strong conservative voices are actually criticizing companies who are doing that, arguing they're taking their eye off the ball of just making money for shareholders. So the attacks are on multiple levels. In Congress, we see them. Last week, there was a hearing on antitrust that had Mindy Luber from Ceres and somebody from Arjuna Capital and somebody from CalPERS under attack by the conservatives in the House who were arguing that they were violating antitrust by talking to each other about issues like climate change and sharing information. Strange, right? Because those same people don't attack oil companies, get together in the American Petroleum Institute and share information and talk about common things, as is their right. So why are investors talking about a key issue? Why is it an antitrust violation? Well, of course, on the floor, there was also Democratic speakers, including the Attorney General of Minnesota, who was a former member of Congress, Mr. Ellison, who is an expert on on both climate, but also on antitrust. And he said there's no evidence of any antitrust violations. But it's back to your point, Karen. It's like, it doesn't matter if there's a real case. It's a good soundbite, right? So you're violating antitrust rules. You're pushing ESG criteria into investment decisions and losing money for beneficiaries. So state of Texas, state of Oklahoma, on you go, has decided to not do business with certain companies that are they consider in that category. So state of Texas pulled $8 billion from BlackRock. Interestingly enough, BlackRock saw its business grow because investors in Europe were very strongly committed to ESG principles, were giving them business. So it's not like they have, of course, no company likes to lose clients, but at the same time, the attacks were misguided, foolish, arguing that BlackRock was boycotting oil companies. Well, interestingly enough, BlackRock owns stock in virtually every oil company. But they also are willing to talk about a need to have a climate transition, right? And that we're all going to face that, whether it's a company or an investor. So we're seeing attacks in the Congress, in the state level. We're seeing attacks by right-wing groups who are attacking companies. We're seeing challenges on the SEC court suits that have blocked, for the moment, the SEC's rule on climate change. This is serious business. We've never seen these issues in our industry under attack like this before. At the same time, we should hear some good news that in fact the attacks have been less successful at the state level. There were legislation and there was laws and regulations proposed in well over 30 states last year, and this year very few of them passed. And interestingly enough, now studies are coming out showing that in Oklahoma or Texas, that the pension funds are actually going to lose perhaps billions of dollars because of the legislation that's passed. So suddenly it becomes an issue of a fiduciary duty for a pension fund. And we've seen some people, I have no idea what their politics are, but working for pension funds or being trustees who say, this is not prudent. I don't want these laws to be passed. So some interesting common sense logic in the investment world coming
Tim,
forth.
can you explain for our audience why these pension funds lost billions? Because of these laws, there's also loss from a taxpayer perspective because less competition for, I mean, I'm talking about like municipal bond issuances by nixing certain banks from bidding for business for these states, you basically had increased debt service for states to issue, general obligation bonds or specific project bonds. So the taxpayer paid, but can you explain why the pension funds also lost billions?
No, but that's a terribly important point then, Stephanie. So who's winning, who's losing by these pieces of legislation? So the pension fund may be losing too if they have to move from specific managers and they have to go to a manager that's costing them more, the fee structure. And then you have the dislocation of moving your investment pool from one manager to another. So the fund is paying often a financial penalty, and as you said, the taxpayer is as well. And in places like Indiana, for example, when the bill was proposed, some of the folks in the pension world did a sort of a cost analysis and a risk analysis of what this bill would mean. And they pointed to ways in which the fund actually, and then the beneficiaries would face penalties from these very, very extreme pieces of legislation.
Thank you. And so, Tim, now we're going to go into the big mammoth case that you've written about. That there's a lot of ink has been spilled on this, but basically that ExxonMobil, which I believe is the largest emitter of carbon dioxide actually, I think of all listed companies, filed a lawsuit against two shareholders, so Arjuna Capital and a Netherlands-based organization, because they filed shareholder proposals requesting that the company do more to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. So what should people know about this case? What is your takeaway, knowing that I think you said there was a recent development.
Yes.
So let's
terribly important case, and not sort of a narrow one. We'll talk about the bigger picture. Our colleague Jim McRitchie just posted the exciting news that last night the judge in the case ruled that it was moot. So that even though there were lots of criticism of Arjuna Capital, he ruled that in fact there was no resolution on the docket, and Arjuna had pledged not to file one next year or to cause it to be filed, and therefore the case was moot. So Exxon, now the case is off the court dockets. But this was a highly unusual action. I should say,
and
interesting.
Why is that? I mean, can you say, like, there's a level of aggression that we haven't seen.
Yes.
So share more for our audience about actually what occurred.
Yeah.
If you don't mind.
So no, not at all. And that is exactly, you put the right the words on the table, a level of aggression. So ExxonMobil for years some of us were involved in these dialogues with them. They were willing to talk to their investors about climate change and about other issues too. And they would actually host seminars, or not seminars, but meetings that maybe 25 investors would come and have a half-day conversation with them about climate, and not just listen to them make presentations, but put their own positions on the record. So here was a company who, for decades, was willing to do that, at least have the door open. So what I said was highly unusual and very aggressive, as you said, Stephanie, is this year Exxon decided to actually sue two investors who had filed a resolution on climate change, urging them to move faster on it. They sued the investors, actually said that if they won, the investors should have to pay court costs, which would, for a small investment firm, was really quite a challenge. But this was very unusual. It's not that it's never happened before, but this was, I think, the first time I've seen a resolution on climate change challenged in the courts, rather than going through the process of appealing to the Securities and Exchange Commission, who would decide whether the resolution could be on or not. And here's the irony. Exxon had a pretty good case if they argued it at the SEC, saying this resolution is pretty similar to one last year that didn't get enough votes. It shouldn't be allowed on the proxy. My own view is they would have had a pretty good possibility of winning at the SEC. But instead, they used a nuclear option, right, of actually suing shareholders and having that suit go on for months, even when Arjuna and Follow This said they pledged not to file the resolution that was being challenged. But the second part of the suit was really not just about these two shareholders. It was attacking the Securities Exchange Commission for the way they had been ruling. So it's not even an oblique attack. It's a rather open attack against the SEC. And I think it was alarming to investors who feared that other companies might follow suit, and this would become a new tactic. Gee, I don't like a resolution, I'm going to sue you. I think it also was an occasion where the aggression you talked about, Stephanie, was not just in the courts. It was in their proxy statement where they challenged and insulted investors who were filing resolutions. They used the term that some of these investors have extreme agendas, meaning they don't have the financial interests of the company at heart. They also argued that they were not really bona fide shareholders because they had small holdings that they had, in Follow This's case, they had bought to be an advocate. But they followed the SEC rules, but Exxon felt they could make an example of them. So this broad case of aggressive actions against investors is basically a new chapter with Exxon, and we hope it's not a new chapter of souring relations between companies and their investors. But here's how investors responded. So two ICCR members, Mercy Investment Services and Westpath, the United Methodist Pension Board, filed a solicitation arguing that investors should vote against both Darren Woods, the CEO, and the lead director, Jay Hooley, because they should be held accountable for this suit. And they made the business case for it. And thus began months of actual lot of stories, a lot of controversy, and many major investors who declared themselves supporting that no vote position, whether it's New York State and New York City or CalPERS and CalSTRS. And CalPERS, the Public Employees Retirement System, didn't just say they were going to vote no, they decided to vote against the whole board. They were active on the airwaves, making the case that this was an abuse of power. Other investors talked about it being bullying. In other words, it was extremely strong pushback. Now, you were talking earlier about symbols, Stephanie, and what mattered. So in the end, Mr. Hooley got about a 13% no vote, which actually puts him in the bottom 10% of directors' votes. And that no vote is not because he doesn't do his job as lead director. It was because of the suit. And it does send a message. I'm not saying Exxon has ears to hear, but the concern about other companies using this as a tactic, if I was the general counsel of any other company who was saying, had a board member or manager saying, maybe we should just sue this shareholder, I would say, let's look at the cost of that, the legal costs, the PR costs, the investor opposition, the public controversy. Maybe we'll get a campaign against our boards. Maybe we'll get other pressures from investors. So I think the message in the marketplace is this is not a wise strategy to use. And that's quite important too. They were even led by Comptroller Brad Lander of New York City, a very interesting letter signed by 13 state and city pension fund leaders to investment managers, urging them to vote no too because of this suit. And I'm glad they did that. It was a strong statement. But at the same time, we didn't see the BlackRocks and the Vanguards and the State Streets voting no. Vanguard explained why. They were impressed by Exxon's profits, so they weren't about to vote no. But they did say they were distressed by this, or concerned about this court case and the precedent that it set. So there were a lot of investors who maybe voted for the board, but still quietly said to the company, this is not a wise strategy. We're not comfortable with it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. I know we could spend a whole day discussing this case. There's lots to uncover. But if we could move on, there's many different ways that investors can engage with companies when issues come up. Can you talk when it's better to divest versus engaging with a company directly? And at what tipping point does divestment really matter? And is it even worth it?
A great question, Karen, and not an easy one to answer. I think your clients, when I worked previously at Boston Trust Walden, we had clients of different persuasions, different views on things. And I have a lot of respect for a university, a foundation, an NGO, a religious groups who decides to say, our values and our beliefs mean that it would be a total contradiction to own shares. And let's make an example, a tobacco company, right? And so they decide to screen, to not own shares, or perhaps to sell them. And then more recently, we have had a huge international debate, of course, about fossil fuel companies. And many investors have decided to step back from owning those shares. And we're talking significant number of share owners, investors with trillions of dollars of assets under management. So it makes a serious statement, but as some others would argue, well, it takes you away from the table, right? You don't have a role to play then if you don't own the shares. Now, it's the reason, Karen, is so complicated. Somebody who's a pro-divestment proponent might say, yeah, but your shareholder advocacy hasn't made enough of a difference. Fair comment. Yeah, when nobody's declaring that shareholder advocacy with oil companies has turned the industry around. But I think we can point to scores of cases where differences have been made on everything from methane flaring to setting greenhouse gas reduction goals. And then the dramatic case a couple of years ago where Exxon actually had 3 board members unseated and new board members being brought on. So we do have those cases to point to. So it may depend partly, Karen, on what the issue is about whether divestment or screening or shareholder advocacy is the route to go. I think a number of ICCR members who decided to be a continuing voice with the Chevrons and Exxons and other companies believe that those voices make a difference even when it's like pushing the rock uphill. And a couple of years ago, Westpath had a resolution to Occidental Petroleum, for example. Back to your point, Stephanie, it got over 50% of the vote. And a couple of years ago, we had resolutions filed on climate lobbying and lobbying with ExxonMobil and Chevron too. But the ExxonMobil resolutions, both of them got over 50% of the vote, and the company stepped up and did meaningful reporting in response. So I believe a strong case can be made that share owner advocacy on a whole range of issues is important, and I'm personally glad there are members of ICCR that have still owned tobacco stock and have been regularly at tobacco stockholders meetings raising issues of health and promotion to youth to smoke, that kind of thing. Even though you'd think, well, many of these companies are still pushing a lethal product out there, but they're also being forced to debate the issue with their shareholders. So I think divestment makes a statement, as a role, but I would argue, as we look at the fossil fuel issue, that rather than taking sort of a doctrinaire position on the strategy, like you should divest or you're not morally responsive, or you should keep your shares, I think both of these strategies have had an impact in the public debate. And of course, going back to our earlier point, they've also had an impact that the right wing has rallied behind the fossil fuel companies and is describing us as trying to destroy our economy by asking for a transition during the climate crisis. So could be a lot longer discussion about that, Karen, but there's a few thoughts.
Thank you.
Ken. Thank you. And by the way, we're going to move to the Q&A session in 2 minutes, so 3 minutes. So if you guys have questions, I see some from Jim McRitchie, please put them in the chat and we will ask Tim. Our final question is just the future of this space. So, and what is your hope for this, for the sector? And also knowing that we have asset owners here listening to you and asset managers, what is your call to action? A lot of this can be overwhelming, can be frightening, but we're not alone. There's a lot of groups and like ICCR, like as you so, you know, we are a movement and movement that has been initiated, you know, I was going to say by people like you. There are very few who started in the 70s as you have. So I'd love to just have a pragmatic call to action, but also hear your hopes for the future.
Oh, thanks so much. And nice to see some friends online too. So I think the first point we could make is we've described the fact that the opposition is as strong as ever and very critical, and as Karen said, very politicizing the debate, where everybody on this call is woke and trying to destroy capitalism. These are actual terms being used, right? So we need to face that's true. But secondly, we need to talk about, well, is that the influential voice in the marketplace? No, it's not. We're in a global marketplace. In Europe, ESG investing is growing by leaps and bounds in places like Japan and other parts of Asia. And secondly, remember we talked about, this is not just a debate about investors, it's about companies as well. So secondly, we are seeing companies sometimes cooling their rhetoric on whether we call it ESG or sustainability, but still being committed to work on diversity or climate change or human rights. Why? Because they see the business case for it. So they're not doing this just, I mean, I'm not saying they don't have hearts that are moved by these issues and want to address them, but I'm also saying they see the business case and see the wisdom of it. So I see ESG continuing to grow. I think it's continuing to grow in the United States, even though it has its ebbs and flows. And we have to push back on some of the myths, like you're losing money through ESG investing. Secondly, companies, I think, we're not going to see companies retreat and step back from their commitment on sustainability. And thirdly, I think that it's possible, it's hard to predict this, but it's possible that the anti-ESG politicized campaigning is going to get a little tired after a while, especially when some of the realities that we've seen with the costs to pension funds comes to bear. So that's getting played out a lot more. So we can go on a lot about what the hopes for the future are and what the lessons are, but to just talk about what we all can do. And you are right, Stephanie, this can get a little intimidating. And somebody might say, why would I want to jump into this muck and mire, right? Well, unfortunately, it's investors, it's our portfolios that are being debated too. And you've taken a position saying that ESG investing is wise and prudent, and you're serving your clients well. And so it's in our interests, as whether it's Veris Wealth Partners or the scores of other investment firms and asset owners, to make the case for why we're doing this and why it has merit and why it has legitimate returns too. Secondly, vote your proxies. These are obvious things. Some asset owners don't necessarily need to file resolutions, although come on in, the water's fine. You could join in a resolution somebody else has filed and do very little heavy lifting, but you're still showing where you stand. But of course, you're going to vote your proxies, and you could write a short letter to a company saying, by the way, I'm a shareholder in company X, and you've got Amazon, you've got this resolution on worker safety, and we want to tell you why that's important to us. So there's voices that need to be heard. There also, because unfortunately these actions that are happening in Congress are really very threatening. I would really encourage, and Veris, you can play your role here with your clients, sending out alerts when there's terribly important legislation coming up. So for example, in July, we expect a vote to be held to reverse the SEC's ruling on climate change, which investors work for, well, I was going to say for 5 years, very hard, but even longer. So this would be just a terrible reversal. And it's important that legislators hear this is important, whether, from all sorts of investors. So that would be encouraged to speak out, whether it's at the state level, but especially when some of these federal pieces of legislation get put on the docket. So there's a few things, Stephanie, for looking forward, what we all can do. And then the final point, I like the way you framed this. You are not doing this alone. It's not like an action that you're doing and you're fighting against Jim Jordan and those who are saying we're trying to destroy capitalism. You're actually joined by firms like Veris, but also a whole community in this country of investors and even some asset managers who are leaders in this space.
Thank you so much. And I have to put a little plug in for USSIF, the U.S. Sustainable Investment Forum. I sit on their board, and that is, and their big conferences in a week in Chicago. And their work is really to help educate, lobby, and mostly educate, because then lobby congressmen and senators to ensure that they understand what ESG investing is. A lot of it is around definitions, and there's a lot of falsehoods that have been, I'd say, pushed or being very influential with representatives who actually don't know what it is. And so whomever comes to them first has more influence. So that's also, education on this subject is important. So thank you.
You're so right, Stephanie. I serve on the policy committee for USF. I did before, and I continue now. And the work they're doing is very important in DC. They're watching these bills and these trends and alerting people when votes are coming up. So it's essential. It's essential work. And by the way, their website has some very helpful things on the attacks on ESG, just
And
some sensible responses.
and talking points and things you can write to your own senators and congressmen. So in terms of questions, we have one which has to do with your personal journey, Tim, and I invite you guys to on the webinar chat if you have more questions, please. So how did you come to ICCR?
Well, thank you,
cover,
Jim.
we didn't
Thank you,
cover
Jim,
that.
for asking that. Happenstance, blind luck. When I was at school at Union Theological Seminary, I actually worked doing field work for the United Church of Christ on the whole issue of South Africa. And so when I graduated, the beginning of ICCR was being formed, and they invited me to help do some ad hoc staff work, which I did, and then that grew over the years. So not a plan. It was good fortune that put me on that path.
Thank you. So another question is on a long uphill climb engagement, such as Amazon. And actually, I was going to go a little further and say, or with companies whose structures are I'd say like Meta, that actually don't lend themselves well to shareholder activism due to the outsized control of the founder. So, and shareholders want short-term success, but these are long-term campaigns. So any advice or comments do you have on those type, and I guess they're all long-term campaigns, but those that are more uphill, especially with the tech stocks?
Yes, yeah. So I think we could take a lesson from some of our past work too on the South Africa issue. We had to have the endurance of the long distance runner, right? We were committed to stick in until things were changing in South Africa, and that gradually 20 years later happened. So I think you're right to point to the fact that maybe it's the American mentality, not just investors. We like to see instant success, but in fact, sometimes that happens. You make a point with a company, maybe through a conversation or a letter or a shareholder engagement, and the company might respond because it makes some sense. They've been thinking about it. They had a staff member or a team in-house that was proposing that kind of thing, and your suggestion came at the right time. But then there's other cases where you feel like, oh, this is a giant, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to imagine the day that giant will move. So in that case, the first thing, obviously, is to recognize that you shouldn't be looking for immediate change. But even if a company is a giant, some of them can do some things that you want to actually give them some recognition for, even if there's other things you would be critical of. So I'm thinking of Amazon. I'm thinking even of the Exxons and other companies in this sphere, and watching that on certain issues, maybe they are hearing and willing to take steps to change. For example, the oil industry is working with some diligence on reducing methane gas from flaring, for example. Well, that's because not just investors, government, the public, and of course the climate crisis sends that message clearly to them that they needed to do it. So I'm not despairing that with a company like Meta or Amazon, that a long-term, consistent, thoughtful, strong professing of the business case, I believe that can have an effect. But we shouldn't be discouraged if it's like, gee, I've been working for this for 10 years and the company isn't changing. That doesn't mean you necessarily go away. Mm-hmm. And I think the other point that you raised, Stephanie, is that there are companies that you're raising issues with where there's a lot of inside stock ownership. So, Zuckerberg controls, what is it, about 60% of their stock. So what we're finding is that some resolutions are being put now, and very wisely, investors are analyzing the votes after the vote to say, these had a majority of outside investors, outside shares voting for them. Well, that sends a message too, that it's been important.
Thank you. And we have, so Amy Dine asked a question which you answered, just about the impact of on the SEC, the Exxon episode on the SEC going forward. We have an anonymous question, which I like, because it's another devil's advocate one. Is there a shareholder that is too small to challenge companies to behave responsibly?
Say that one again.
Is there a shareholder that is too small? So the minimum, the $2,000 owner, does the system
No, it's
make
a great
sense?
question. I got it. Yeah. Well, my answer to that is no, but the caveat is it depends. So there are companies who are going to say that investor is just an individual who is a pain in the neck. But, and so you will get ignored by some companies, right? But there's some investors who say, well, listen, especially if an investor is writing us, and it's an issue of the day that maybe students are bringing up, and it's being debated in scientific circles or whatever, you can still have a ripple effect. So there's a woman named Jan Dell, who's quite an expert on plastics issues. It's her vocation to challenge plastic waste. And she actually has some shares and filed a resolution with Kraft Heinz on and I think got a decent vote in the 20% range. But here's an individual, I don't think she's a huge investor, but she knows of which she speaks. She did what's called an exempt solicitation, arguing the case for other investors. And she is one of those prophets in the marketplace who's raising an issue, right? Now, there are some individual investors who are also pushing self-interested questions or zany questions like, I want you to change your product line or something like that. And those will, under management may be respectful and polite, because after all, they're a share owner, but basically they're going to get that position is going to get ignored, probably, as it should. But it's not because they're small. It's because that they didn't make a very good case for their position. And some small shareholders are making excellent cases, whether it's Jim McRitchie and John Chevedden on some governance issues, or Jan Dell.
And then getting significant votes in their favor.
Yeah.
So that the proof is in, I guess, the followership of the it's not the size of the investor that matters. It's the quality of the issue that is brought up. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and sometimes I did mention earlier that you can be sort of raising an issue in the early days that doesn't seem to have a lot of public attention, right? And then 10 years later, it's an issue whose time has come. And therefore, you planted seeds, you planted them with the company, you planted it in the investor ecosphere, and it bore fruit.